Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me on the return, I think this is number 3 now, is Thamil Ananthavinayagan. Thamil, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me again.
So I reached out to Thamil because in 2021, the highest, at least downloaded episode of the Sensible Socialist was our conversation on left critique of international law, which I was pleasantly surprised by. Sometimes you dip your toe into the hustle and bustle of intra-left conflict or things that are going on in the news, which, international law is something that people talk about, but it's not always, maybe the sexiest topic for a podcast. But hey, if it's, it's what people's interested in, I'm more than happy to talk about it. And so I thought that was a nice little surprise.
Yeah, I hear Jay-Z in the background screaming encore. So here we are again.
Yeah.
It feels like, a continuation of a very long conversation.
So because we did get into more of kind of your background and stuff like that, maybe if we do a kind of truncated for those that haven't that didn't hear that one, or can you give a little bit of a background as to sort of who you are, and then to your sort of general approach to international law?
Yeah. So happy to be here again. My name is Thamil Ananthavinayagan. So I was born and raised in Germany. I'm a German citizen. My parents, however, are from Sri Lanka. My father himself was a Tamil freedom hero, fighting for the liberation of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and came to Germany eventually, where he found his safe haven. I was educated in law in Germany. I worked for the German Labour Party, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, SPD, for many years in the parliament, as well as for outside the parliament and ministries. Eventually I worked as a junior lawyer in Germany and worked there for a year or so before then deciding to enter academia. And I did a master's in Maastricht in the Netherlands in international law and international human rights law, and then continuing to do a PhD at NUI Galway. People shouldn't reduce Galway to Ed Sheeran solely. It's a beautiful city in the Republic of Ireland, the country of the resistance. And I then moved to Dublin with my wife, and I taught there international law and international human rights law at a couple of universities like DCU, Dublin City University, UCD, University College of Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, but also at Griffith College Dublin. So I went through all the Dublin universities there. And then since 2021, February 2021, I started to February, March, April, early 2021, I started to teach at the University of Nottingham. So I'm currently a teaching associate in international human rights law, and I'm teaching a range of different subjects and researching in particular the area of TWAILer, which stands for Third World Approaches to International Law. And this particular scholarship believes that international law as it stands is deeply colonial and it reproduces colonial hierarchies through its laws and its institutions. So we, as we discussed in previous episodes, especially the first one that I did with Kevin, we discussed, issues of, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but also the United Nations, how they are entrenching Western hegemony, and how we as third world approaches international law scholars are trying to decolonize and develop counter-hegemonic tactics to overcome these issues. So that would be about myself and the scholarship that I belong to.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time, especially regarding the kind of great power leadership of at least the Security Council at the UN, given the fact that we're, in a moment of potential conflict, like great power conflict over, over Ukraine, and the goal of the UN system being a reliance on the great powers to sort of never have this situation, so that they would be the maintainers of international peace and security. And as we've seen, specifically with the United States, that they are often the instigators of potential disruptions in international peace and security. And so the cracks, I think, were, began very quickly, but they are ever expanding as time continues to go on, where the institutions of the UN, deeply flawed as they are, don't seem to be at least subject to enough criticism and clamors for reform that are actually in place, partially because it is set up as a system to entrench and maintain the hegemony of former and continuing imperial forces.
Yeah. I mean, it's not. I mean, look, our conversation today is a bit different, but you touched upon a important point. And unfortunately, being a German myself, I do follow the news how Germany is acting in this Ukraine crisis. The head of the German Marine had to issue his resignation because he was at some sort of a conference meeting in New Delhi, end of January, I think. And he made some remarks on the Ukraine crisis where he said the whole Ukraine crisis, Russia is not going to intervene into Ukraine, but the whole issue is that Putin needs the respect that he deserves. So he was quite open and undiplomatic in this conversation, in this interview. And he said there is a lack of respect for Putin, and I think that Putin is one of the strongest world leaders in the world, and the Western world is not giving him that respect. And he was quite frank and blunt about this, and then the German government was putting pressure, and the German media was putting some pressure that he has to resign immediately. Yeah, I mean, look, Western hegemony is very openly at display in the case of Ukraine. When it came to Venezuela a couple of years ago, when the German ambassador shielded Guaido at the airport, nobody wanted to talk about, the violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and interference into Venezuelan affairs. And now we see the same issues where we are, apparently Russia did something wrong, and we don't see the double game here. So Western hegemony is a full display, and Ukraine is currently, a mass example for that. But look, that's another part of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it dovetails in the sense of the difference between the talk, the language, and the reality of sort of what you might call international law, even on the subject of human rights. And I think, so to get into that, the goal of this is to hone in on a kind of certain sector of human rights. But I think to round it out, human rights is a kind of, I would say, relatively novel concept in terms of, coming out of World War II, a refocus on kind of defining what it means. You have the UN Declaration of Human Rights. There's this notion that coming out of the kind of liberal tradition of saying that yes, there's whether endowed by your creator, as in the U.S. context, or as established by legitimate sovereign authority, or whatever you want to say is the kind of germination of these rights, that each individual human being as a human being has a certain amount of protection owed to them and the ability to interact in a kind of way that represents, I think, like very much in the philosophical milieu of the time, this notion of being authentically themselves and this ability to kind of try to realize the grand sort of enlightenment values of freedom and autonomy and individual sort of self-authorship and these kind of notions. And I think for me, studying these sort of things, there's a number of different human rights instruments, but I think they are highly encapsulated in two particular international covenants: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so to differentiate them, the often kind of, in some ways, truncated or simple to understand version is that there's these kind of two forms of human rights. There are the so-called negative human rights, those rights that you must be protected from the infringement of, and the so-called positive rights, the ones that your sort of organization of government owes to you, and that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are the negative rights. So these are the prohibitions on government infringement on things like what we're familiar with in the United States, but all over the world: the right to freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, not to be arbitrarily detained. I think that the first one, the most important one, the right to life, to not just be arbitrarily killed. Though I find it somewhat ironic, and I know there's been work on this, that it specifically says that while maybe the death penalty is not necessarily a per se violation of the right to life, you at least can't be killed or can't be sentenced to death without the ability to appeal. It's like, okay, I guess they still wanted to. You got a human right to life, but immediately, I think in some ways it's very indicative of this liberal notion of the fact that, yeah, you have rights, but like, here's the immediate exception and the immediate notion of how they can be abrogated. But you have, these are important rights: the right to not be infringed on trying to form a labor union, for instance, and protections on the rights of children, and a number of different important, again, kind of non-infringement rights. And these are, I think, and again, relating to the fact of where they come from out of this liberal bourgeois tradition, that they are sort of well established, entrenched, and there's no notion that like these are something that has to come gradually. These are rights or prohibitions on government action that are immediate. They are, essentially in the international law schema, once you are either a signatory or an actual state party, or once it becomes a sort of jus cogens norm, then you are not, a violation of any of these is a violation of human rights immediately, right now, as soon as they come into effect. And that makes them have some kind of power. They are established, they're fairly easy to understand, and they are immediately actionable. And so that seems to me to be, that it appears to be relatively uncontroversial in the human rights field and state adoption of them. There's not a lot of, outliers in terms of people who are not necessarily signing on to at least the spirit of these. Yet, of course, we realize that though you have signatories and state parties, and now this is to the point at which it is applicable even if you're not a signatory or a state party, these violations of these rights are rampant and constant. And though there is a committee that's established in the treaty to review these, there is no real mechanism to be able to enforce these rights. and there's no way to sort of punish violators of them aside from a potential report coming out of a UN committee that says, "Ooh, bad you." And of course, who is under the eyes of this committee becomes important and related to the third world approaches of international law. How often do we see a report on the United States, who again has a pretty horrible track record when it comes to at least the death penalty, much less violations of the right to assemble and things like that. Of course, violations of our own constitution, but certainly violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so, even though there is this notion that they are immediately actionable in the sense that they are obligations of states, there's routine violations of them. And so, what kind of, I don't know what you say, what value they hold seems to me, I'm curious what you think about this, more aspirational than they are actionable.
Yeah, no, you're dead right with all the outlook that you gave and the discussion you offered. I mean, if we look at economic and social rights, but also civil and political rights in particular, the history of them coming to being is a rather new development, right? We after the end of the Second World War, we had the Universal Declaration for Human Rights with the UDHR, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin D. And her idea was to have a declaration that really encompassed economic and social rights as well as civil and political rights. And we see that. I mean, there are these different rights that are enshrined in the UDHR. And the problem, however, it was just a declaration. And the Human Rights Commission, shortly after, under the United Nations auspices, started to draft the two covenants, the ICCPR and the ICESCR, and there was no agreement to have one common covenant. And the reason was there was the schism between the Western states, the Western world, and the other world, if you wish, led by the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union and its allies were emphasizing economic and social rights, the obligations of the state towards its citizens, whereas the Western world, led by the US, said, well, don't go that far. Are economic and social rights really human rights? Let's focus on those rights that are, as you said yourself, negative rights, namely, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. I mean, when I taught economic and social rights only last semester to the master's students, I mean, the easy thing about negative rights, the civil and political rights, is you don't have to invest anything in it. You don't have to invest any state resources, right? You don't have to pay anything to allow freedom of expression. If people are turning up at a demonstration, you send 2 or 3 police officers, perhaps to safeguard the demonstration, but that's it. However, on the other hand, right to health as a positive right is something where a state has to invest money. And I think that was something that the liberals and the neoliberals from the Western states didn't want to make any commitment towards. So having said that, we came then to the divorce of human rights in the 1960s, 1963, with the ICCPR on the one hand and the ICESCR on the other hand, 2 different covenants that were drafted, and then and different state bodies have signed up to them. Obviously, the Western states not very inclined to accept the ICESCR as a treaty for them to be binding. But interestingly, I think over the years, in its history, and we look at, the discussion now on the history, the development, the evolution of these two different set of rights. If we look at this evolution in more detail, if you think of the Vienna Declaration for Human Rights in 1993, it made it quite clear that human rights are indivisible, they are interrelated, and that you cannot think of one right without the other right. So the indivisibility, the interrelatedness were stressed by the Vienna Declaration. And my former law teacher, and I personally call him also one of my mentors, Theo van Boven, a great Dutch human rights scholar, who had to leave his position as at the time head of the human rights program of the United Nations due to the pressure of Ronald Reagan. Funny enough, he said or wrote once in an interesting chapter on the categories of human rights. He made a quite interesting statement. He said, "You cannot talk about the right to health without talking about the right to life, because the right to health is a condition for the right to life." So they reinforce each other, right? The right to health reinforces the right to life. You cannot think of it differently. So he wanted a more, also expensive form of interpretation of the right to life, because he said, even if you don't accept the right to life, the right to health in your constitutions, the right to life, the right to health can be read into the right to life in your respective constitutions. And interestingly, the German Constitutional Court has been very innovative in this regard. There was a lot of judicial activism to read economic social rights into civil and political rights. The Indian Supreme Court, as an example from moving from the global north now to global south, is also a great example how economic and social rights are innovatively discussed, interpreted through judicial activism. And I think the most important constitution in the world that has been very influential and very innovative in combining economic and social rights with civil and political rights is the South African post-apartheid constitution. They have been very innovative in introducing economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. So what I want to say is basically, and this brings me back to what you said there, Kevin, we don't have an international enforcement body, yes, but we need to really focus on judicial activism in respective jurisdictions to interpret economic and social rights in such a fashion that they are forcing the positive obligations of states. And there are these different decisions that or different Supreme Courts and Constitutional Courts around the world who have led the way, and they can be further triggered and further attracted by grassroots activism. And I think there's a lot to learn in that regard.
Yeah, I think, it's in terms of the, like you kind of laid it out a bit, but the ideological relationship between these two sets of rights. I mean, it's the civil and political rights are like the liberal like notions of what human rights sort of mean, and the economic, social, and cultural rights are, I would probably say, even like more social democratic than like directly communist or socialist or something like that. But these social democratic rights of, if we quickly even kind of go through it, I think what's interesting is that like when you're talking about the split of these, when you read the conventions themselves, they have common articles. The beginning kind of you might call throat clearing parts of the articles. There's relationships, non-discrimination, is a principle of both, related to both. And so obviously that has a kind of interesting heightened aspect in terms of how we understand how to kind of interpret what they are. They're like the equality of men and women in terms of the right, the applicability of these rights. That like there's this commonality between the two of them, and then but once you get into kind of the meat of them, that's when they change. And when you get into the economic, social, and cultural rights, I know that like maybe you shouldn't do this, but there is a sense in which rights comes first. What's the first right, that is said in the conventions. And the first one in the economic, social, cultural rights is the right to work. And that's not just the right to like have a job. It includes the right for everyone to have the opportunity to gain their living by work, which they freely choose and or accept, and will take the appropriate steps to safeguard the right. The steps taken by the state party to the convention to achieve the full realization of this right should include technical and vocational guidance and training programs, essentially school. And now today, like that would to me that would be an undergraduate level, polytechnic or traditionally sort of your standard undergraduate education. But that they have policies and techniques to achieve steady economic, social, and cultural development and the full and productive employment under conditions safeguarding fundamental political and economic freedoms of the individual. Wow. To an American ear, right? I think most Americans are like, what? You don't have the right to a job, and not only to like any job, but a job that you freely choose, that and that also comes with a kind of right, it's later on in here, but a right to education, at least enough to get you a job. All right. That's already to me, I think like one that is of super importance and like a base level, but it is also still not necessarily some kind of again, a kind of communist thing. In the Marxist real tradition, the notion would be that like you wouldn't even have a job, that you wouldn't have this right to work, that you would be able to freely associate your labor in some kind of different system. And so these are social democratic in a sense. Now, that doesn't mean they're bad. It means they're good. But you have, Article 7, which I want to talk about a little bit more in detail with you, because I think it expresses some of the problems with this, like that were the aspirational as compared to the real fundamental. But the right to the, I love the language, the right of everyone to the enjoyment of just and favorable conditions of work. Just and favorable. That the philosopher in me goes, wow, we have a lot of fun, pedantic and semantic work to do to determine what that means. But like remuneration for everyone, that's fair wages, another pedantic thing that we have to go through. Equal remuneration for work of equal value without distinction of any kind. Obviously between men and women specifically, but that provides a decent living for themselves and their family. Again, what does decent mean? And safe and healthy working conditions, equal opportunity for everybody, and then rest, leisure, and reasonable limitations of working hours. Again, the common thing that the 8-hour day, let's say, as maybe is potentially representative of. But so I want to talk more specifically about those. So we'll hold off for a second. But like Article 8 is talking about trade unions and protections of rights on trade unions. Article 9, the right of everyone to Social Security. And, before we started it, the interesting thing about, again, juxtaposing this is like, the American tendency to not distinguish between someone who is left of center, a social democrat, and like a communist, because it gets like, there's some communist stuff here. It's like, right, Social Security, the same people who would say, you see a sign at a protest that says the government take their hands off my Social Security, right? But that it's Bismarckian, that this is an attempt to stave off sort of socialist uprisings and socialist growth of interest in socialism, rather than a kind of expression of a socialist dream or something like that. But also, the right to Social Security. I think in the United States, that's something, though it's been whittled away and been less important over time, that you don't have in some place like India, right? And that is it's a kind of there's also it's the right to Social Security, comma, including social insurance. I'm, again, interesting question in terms of what social insurance means, and this goes into what I do want to talk to you about in terms of how narrow or expansive we want to really consider these, right? But like the widest assistance according to the family, protections of the family, care for children, marriage, only consensual marriage, no forced marriages, like what's the next one? An adequate standard of living for people, including adequate food, clothing, housing, and the continuous improvements of living conditions, right? These are, to me, you continue to go down, like the right of everyone for the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, right? Now that, to me, is an obligation, not even to just have an NHS, but relating back to even how these interrelate with each other, the just and enjoyable conditions of work, the ability to access education, and those kinds of things are what it means to have, the highest attainable standard of mental health, let's say. Article 13 is the right to education, the idea that everyone should, at least primary education, be free, and that secondary education should be accessible, whatever, again, accessible means. And so I think there's the right to partake in cultural life, right? And I think this relates in some ways and dovetails with genocide convention and things like that. The idea that there should not be actions that like diminish, let's say in Turkey, the use of Kurdish as a language, or performing non-dominant religion practices like you might find in some places in the Middle East, where you have minority religions that may be subject to prohibitions on using. I think in Syria that definitely happens, and so these all sound super great, like to someone who wants to see the sort of flourishing of human beings or something like that. Like, yes, okay, cool. Like, and I want these to have the same kind of level of force and general applicability that we'd have in these in the economic, or sorry, in the civil and political rights. But then you get this notion, I can't remember which one it is, what article actually talks about it, or where it does, but this notion of progressive realization.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, like, if you're the professor, so the kind of, I'm curious your perspective on, is the normal kind of explanation is, well, like you said, these things cost money, they take resources, and so we can't just say to everybody, well, these are instantly actionable and that you have to do these now, but that we're going to build into this, which seems reasonable, this notion that like you gotta do these things as you're capable of doing. But I think for me, the criticism of that is when there's no like guidelines in terms of when these things become like a problem. Are they progressively realizable forever? Do you have to have a certain per capita GDP? What is the, how do I know when I'm out of the, I can't provide adequate housing to everybody because I'm, not one of the major economic players in the world, And so how do you see this notion of progressive realization and its impact on the actual applicability of what these high sounding human rights?
Yeah. The issue of progressive realization under Article 2 gives a lot of space and a lot of room for maneuver for the state parties, and I think it is also contributed to the fact that we are enticing those state parties to enjoy their state sovereignty, and it's within their realm to do so. And Article 2 has been always a trouble for me to discuss, especially with the students that I've taught in the past, and as I said, earlier, this module that I taught last semester, because it allows you for a lot of room. So, I was just looking up something that I discussed with the students that I taught. In 2012, the chairperson on the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, Ariranga Pillai, said something quite interesting, or, it was under the pressure that the committee didn't, gives any sort of an indication to state parties in face of the financial crisis, that the Committee on Economic and Social Rights didn't act, didn't say something clearly amid the financial crisis. And what they said in this, or the chairperson said in this letter to the state parties, is the following: the committee has observed over recent years the pressure on many state parties to embark on austerity programs, sometimes severe, in the face of rising public deficit and poor economic growth. Decisions to adopt these austerity measures are always difficult and complex, and the committee is acutely aware that this may lead many states to take decisions with sometimes painful effects, especially when these austerity measures are taken in recession. And then Ariranga Pillai continues by saying the first. So he says, in such cases, the committee emphasizes that any proposed policy change or adjustment has to meet the following requirements. First, the policy is a temporary measure covering only a period of crisis. Second, the policy is necessary and proportionate in the sense that the adoption of any other policy or failure to act would not be detrimental to economic and social rights. Third, the policy is not discriminatory and comprises all possible measures, including tax measures, to support social transfer to mitigate the inequalities that can grow in times of crisis. So, this was a direct reaction to the financial crisis back then. But what happens here is the committee says only, hey, we know that you're doing that, and you have every reason to do that because you are, facing a severe crisis. But please take into account that there are certain social rights and economic rights that you need to uphold. But at the end of the day, they're playing the ball back to the state parties, right? And progressive realization is then, become some form of a way for states to say, listen, we have to work towards it according to the maximum available resources, and we can take retrogressive measures if we need to consolidate our state finances. So it gives too much of room to state parties to circumvent and invest in the effective enjoyment and realization of the obligations under the ICESCR. And as we know, the financial crisis and now also COVID has actually shown that the disparity between the richest and the poorest is just growing. It is making evident that COVID didn't make, and the financial crisis didn't make the gap. The gap was existent already. It made it even more clearer. And state parties have used these occasions to say, you know what, we're not going further than this in terms of realization because we have to face another crisis. But COVID and the banking crisis, the financial crash in 2008, has made the richest even more richer. Mm-hmm. And it's a fact. The recent Oxfam report regarding the COVID crisis has evidently made clear that people like Bezos and Musk and others became even more rich. And if you know, to be very open about this and explain it in this fashion, if they have the money to shoot themselves into the moon or into the space, you know, why shouldn't we tax them more? Why aren't states in the position under Article 2 towards a progressive realization of economic and social rights to tax them more in order to actually achieve the progressive realization? So what I want to say to answer this is the progressive realization under Article 2 is giving too much room. It's offering too much navigation space to states in order to avoid their direct obligations under the covenant. And that's a fact. And the only way to actually attack the state is perhaps through domestic action. And I think grassroots activists, as I said at the very beginning, are going to play a big role in the future. The judiciaries are going to play a very, very big role in the future. But coming back also to, I think, our first conversation that we had, we have at the international level now, you know, moving away from the domestic level, but then again looking at the international level. If you think of the special procedure systems of the United Nations Human Rights Council, we have mandate holders on different human rights, such as, importantly, the right to food or the right to housing. The right to solidarity is actually a very important right that needs to be fleshed out. So these different economic social rights have mandate holders who are TWAILers. And think of the mandate holder for the right to housing is Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who is from the US, who is a professor at MIT. We have Michael Fakir from the University of Oregon from Lebanon, who is the mandate holder for right to food. And then we have Obi Okafor, who is from Nigeria/Canada, who's currently a professor at, I think, Johns Hopkins. And these persons are mandate holders from the Third World Approaches International Law, who can flesh out, make clearer that there are, you know, the states need to make active investments in circumventing the further drifting apart of society. And just to, you know, finish with 1-2 sentences on this matter, namely, so I mean, if you think of Philip Alston, Australian human rights academic, he was the former special rapporteur on extreme poverty, and he's definitely not a TWAILer, but you know, he comes from this old school of human rights, from a very liberal approach. But he was quite interestingly saying that before he started the mandate, he finished the mandate already on extreme poverty, but he said, before I started the mandate, I never thought about this idea of neoliberalism. I never used the word neoliberalism before. And only when he became the special rapporteur, he realized neoliberalism is actually a threat to the enjoyment of economic and social rights. And if such a person like him says that, because neoliberalism is a wanted, deliberate attack of the state and the markets on the enjoyment of economic and social rights. So if the state is not going to ensure under Article 2 of the ICESCR the progressive realization, then we need to shift the focus towards grassroots activism. And with the title of Balakrishnan Rajagopal that I mentioned earlier, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, we have to create an international law from the below. And I think the movement goes towards, a movement from the bottom to the top rather than from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relatively obvious in terms of where this has all gone, that the idea that the true enactment of these high ideals will somehow come down from on high is not going to happen. It is not reasonable, and it is likely not the one that you'd actually want. You don't want, and these things don't ever become really truly realized if they are, if they come down from the top. I mean, I think even the sort of experience of the Soviet Union in a lot of different ways is an example of the fact that even what could be benefits to increases in sort of general social security and your general welfare, if it does not come from it does not continue to come from a regenerative or generative force at the bottom of society, at the lowest kind of levels, then it will not long endure, and it is often much more hollow than it may sort of appear. And so I think that's a point that's sort of necessary to kind of to hammer home. I think one of the frustrations I've had, going back to like the comment on COVID regarding progressive realization, is one, the threat of neoliberalism and just the role of neoliberalism. I think it was Noam Chomsky that said neoliberalism is an interesting phrase for this ideology because it's neither new nor is it liberal. And I think that's sort of very true. It doesn't even pretend to live up to kind of the so-called values of like sort of liberalism, that it's much, even on like the ICCPR stuff, there's, there is technically a mechanism by which you would abrogate the rights in the treaty, and well, lo and behold, every year there's a crisis in which, we have to abrogate the human rights now because and so it's not really this new crop of people in the sort of post Reagan Thatcher era are again neoliberals in name, because again not liberal, but the frustration I have with at least like the council and much of the commentary on human rights, the social, economic, and cultural ones that come from non-TWAILers, let's say, which are, though I am happy to say, a growing number of people, especially with like a sort of younger people coming into it and seeing the kind of failure, to be perfectly honest with you, of the real enforcement and true realization of these human rights. It's not a majority, and so a lot of the commentary from, especially high places in academia and political forces, is very tepid and light and non-expansive, very restrictive. It hitches very hard to this, this notion of progressive realization. That notion, that Article 2 idea gives to me this kind of initial pulling in of the scope of what these really mean, and I think because section part number 2 of Article 2 is the non-discrimination clause. Can't discriminate based on race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, social origin, property, or birth or status. That actually becomes overly focused on. Now, I don't want to say it's not important. It's also stated in the ICCPR. Obviously, the principle of non-discrimination is very important. You want to make sure that it is universally applicable. But it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The sort of philosophical underpinning of human rights is that as a human being, you are given those. So the discrimination, the anti-discrimination statements, to me, they are kind of unnecessary if you adopt the position that that human rights are universal. Then non-discrimination is in the definition of what it is to be a human right. But when you look at commentary on so getting down to the specifics of what these actual human rights entail in terms of government action, you get either statements that are vague and it's not really clear, and it depends on the state, and like what resources did the state have, and what does it mean to be adequate in South Africa as compared to adequate in Hoboken, or like and as compared to Siberia or Mumbai or something, right? What does adequate mean? Well, it's hard to know. Like we'll have to like the state to decide what that means and something like that. But when we get into, especially because it is a socialist podcast, going back to the Article 7, discussions of what a just and favorable conditions of work means, what remuneration that encompasses the notion of fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value without distinction of any kind. As a person who is well acquainted with both classical economics, Marxist economics, and even sort of neoclassical economics, that has different definitions depending on how you look at it. But as somebody who understands and I think agrees with the Marxian economic approach, fair wages for work of equal value is a decrease or an elimination of the extraction of surplus value, which is the basis for the generation of profit, which is in a capitalist economy the point of economic engagement. And so a expansive view of what this really means comes up against generally accepted notions of like, it is what it is. We live in a capitalist world. When Nancy Pelosi was asked if the Democratic Party in the United States would, realize that much of its younger base is interested in socialism, she said, well, just we're capitalists, right? And so there's this deep capitalist realism that like capitalism is, in Margaret Thatcher's world, there's no alternative. It is the status quo and it is going to be. And so you can't, in some ways, understand fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value on the principle that it demands a negation of the basic employer-employee relationship, which I think it could read that way. And I think a legitimate reading of that human right necessitates that we, if we were to truly realize this human right, need to fundamentally change the relationship at work. But when I went looking for commentary on like this specific right, especially coming from the committee, what I found was little to nothing, giving any kind of specification. And what I did find focused on the second part of it, which is in particular, women being guaranteed conditions of work non-inferior to those enjoyed by men. So again, this pivot away from what does the universal human right mean to we need to make sure that what we do see in the world, which is legitimate, that there's a unfair distribution of wages between men and women, that women are a sort of hyper-exploited part of the working class in the world generally, and particularly in the global south, but even in the global north. So it's not that it's illegitimate to discuss that, but it needs to be, it can be often a kind of cover so that we don't have to talk about the more confrontational aspects of what these human rights mean, and confrontational in the sense that it may brush up against this deep-seated sort of capitalist or bourgeois realism that like these economic, social, and cultural rights do not suggest that we need to fundamentally readjust our economic system. It just means that we have to, like, again, in this social democratic mindset, switch a few levers, increase some taxes, and divert resources to that. And I think that that is a limitation on this interpretation of what these mean, that I think especially understanding the idealistic Soviet members of the negotiating table of this covenant would be extremely, frustrated by. And I am, extremely frustrated by.
Yeah, no, I mean, something I would be also frustrated by. I was just, while you were talking, I was just quickly double checking something, namely, I mean, I just read out to you this statement of the chairperson of the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, where he was lifting his finger and saying, listen, you know, even though we have the financial crisis, you have to abide by X, Y, Z. Like, I mean, that's like just only, you know, the statement was issued only under pressure because the public said, you know, there are cuts to the public system, people are losing jobs, clear violation of Article 6. You have to do something. And I was just checking something, you know, the general comment 3. So for the listeners and viewers of this interview, the committee that I'm referring to is like the committee is established by the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights and oversees the implementation of the covenant in the different countries of state parties that have signed up to it. So every 5 years, the state parties present their report on the progressive realization or not on economic and social rights in their respective countries, and they are saying what they have achieved or not achieved. The committee then issues their recommendations and their conclusions on that. So anyway, the committee consists of experts, human rights experts, to do that, and it's not only their role to, you know, oversee the implementation. They issue these statements, and they issue also something that is called general comments. And that's why I was just checking while you were talking, Kevin. I was looking at general comment number 3, which was, you know, it clarifies the different articles and the legal scope of it. And I just looked at something which outraged me, you know, while you were talking. It outraged me. General comment number 3. You know, I don't want to make it too legalese for the listeners, but I think, you know, after the success of the first podcast, I think people are interested in the law. So there is paragraph 9 of this general comment number 3 from 1919. If anyone is interested, put it down into Google. General comment of the covenant of the Committee on Economic and Social Rights.
I'll put it in the description for the video too, so
yes,
you'll be able to find
you
it
can
easy.
do that. Yes. So what they say here is under paragraph 9. So this is, again, this is 1990. So they say the principal obligation of result reflected in Article 2.1 is to take steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the covenant, including Article 6, obviously, and the others that we had just mentioned. So, and then they say the concept of progressive realization constitutes a recognition of the fact that full realization of all economic, social, cultural rights will generally not be able to be achieved in a short period of time. All right, that's fine. I mean, you know, Rome was not built in one day. But then it says towards the very end of that paragraph, and that outraged me. It says here, moreover, any deliberately retrogressive measures in that regard would require the most careful consideration and would need to be fully justified by reference to the totality of the rights provided for in the covenant and in the context for the use of the maximum available resources. So that is, you know, outraged me, because what does the committee do here? They basically allow for retrogression in relation to the covenant. So what they say is, well, you know, actually you're not allowed to, but, you know, in very exceptional circumstances, you can do it. So what do they do here is they say to the states, listen, you can take the measures necessary if you are facing an emergency, a financial emergency in your situation. So 2008, if we use 2008 as a yardstick, we could fire people, we could furlough people, we could kick people out of their houses. So we violated right to work, right to housing. But at the same time, we had the big players who are too big to fail, namely the banking system.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we had the money for that. And it apparently fell within the sovereign decision of the states to do so. And we couldn't question them. And the committee gave them the platform, a vessel, for a legal vessel with the general comment number 3 for the argumentation, well, you could take the measures necessary in order to meet your financial needs, right? So Article 6, we have seen, you know, a constant onslaught on economic and social rights with the era of neoliberalism. The era of neoliberalism has foreseen the action, the onslaught on economic and social rights, and the possibility to take the measures necessary to withdraw from the progressive realization were given by the committee. The committee allowed, basically, in exceptional circumstances, to do so, and neoliberalism and neoliberal thinkers have continued to allow the social security state to shrink. They allowed for economic and social rights to be just becoming a shallow construct under international law. I mean, we've seen, however, also positive developments at the international political level. When we look at Chile, Chile was the lab for Thatcher and for Reagan for neoliberalism after they intervened and overthrew the Salvador Allende government and installed Pinochet, who and Milton Friedman and others obviously used this lab called Chile for their neoliberal practices. And we have recently, however, seen that the people of Chile are sick and tired of the denial of economic and social rights for decades. And they have voted for a Chilean president who is going to hopefully reconstruct and reinstall the vision of Allende. So it was a counter reaction. Again, I'm coming back to my idea of the base, the people on the lower bottom who reacted. Grassroots activism that brought this former student activist into power as president, because in the face of a massive disparity, because the state didn't want to invest into the progressive realization on economic and social rights. So I think we are seeing with the financial crisis 2008, with the worldwide pandemic, the necessity that we need to invest in economic and social rights, and in my view, we have different fronts with which we have to fight for the progressive realization. As I said earlier, the UN Special Rapporteurs will be playing a key role in the fulfillment. The TWAILer scholars who I mentioned earlier have a key role to play in expanding the legal scope, to interpret the legal scope of the different economic and social rights under their mandate. We have to rely on the grassroots activists, but also the judiciaries in the respective states. But I'm also thinking that we need to revamp the ICESCR. We have to really rethink, shouldn't we look into another optional protocol at the international level? An optional protocol that could actually amend the ICESCR in a way that we are prioritizing economic and social rights. But until then, we should make use of civil and political rights as a vessel. And I come back again to what Theo van Boven said. We cannot separate right to life from right to health. And another important point, and that brings us to Article 6 and right to work. We could have innovative approaches to talk about the right to life as well, and say, well, the right to life cannot be secured if you cannot have a decent standard of living.
Yeah.
Right? And the decent standard of living is achieved through work. So innovative approaches by scholars, but also judges, is necessary for action that forces the state to act.
Yeah.
The state has to be forced.
Yeah, especially it just made me laugh that listening to General Comment 3 too, like how infuriating. And I think it is taking a kind of Article 4 of the ICCPR gives the grounds by which you can derogate certain human rights, like in an emergency situation that threatens the life of the nation or its existence is officially proclaimed, which emergencies in the U.S. get claimed anytime there's a natural disaster, like anything like that, even if it's confined to a specific area. But and then I guess we can abrogate our human rights obligations. But number 2, paragraph 2 of Article 4 says, but there's no derogation from Article 6, 7, 8, 11, 15, 16, and 18. Like, just per se, nope. And the thing that is infuriating about that General Comment 3 is that there's no delineation of like, okay, yes, maybe you might like chill out on some of them, but like, the right to housing, no. Right? The right to work, no. Like, you still have that obligation. You don't get to like stop people from getting educated just because there's an economic crisis. And like, there's lots of good economics about how the fact that that's actually the time to invest in those things, like in periods of crisis and stuff. And so but I think you're right. To kind of wrap it all up and in some ways to echo what you were saying too, the scholarship, scholars, academics, even people in the positions, on and mandates at the people in the committee and stuff like that, they do not have a mechanism for force. There is no club at which they can beat states, with to comply. That only comes from civil society actors that can mobilize enough people who generally care about that to make those kind of changes. And I think Chile is a great example. Even the United States, in its massive support for Bernie Sanders, if there had not been a surreptitious and downright illegal coordination, and if our elections were not highly managed by two corrupt and nefarious parties, we would have had a social democratic wave in the United States that would have accompanied Bernie Sanders, because that's what it takes. It takes the states are not like, they're looking for the General Comment 3s, the Article 4s, the way in which they can maintain their power by not having to actually abide by these good notions of human rights. So the enforcers of human rights, you can say philosophically, every person has human rights, but it comes down to every person who has human rights to enforce them. And that means that in our interpersonal relationships, in our group dynamics, and going up to the state, the obligation is fundamentally on us, both as individuals, but as the collective. And that our human rights are only as real and enforceable as we make them a reality and enforce them, both in our interactions with one another, but also in the organizations that we choose to be a part of, and that we choose to give the ultimate control as to whether or not they incarcerate us forever, or they decide whether or not we're going to invest in housing, education, and these kinds of things. And so the power does not rest at the UN or at the the Economic, Social, Cultural Committee, or this is not where power rests. These are guideposts. These are the keys to to give you the arms by which you can fight, but they are not the mechanism to fight. That's the street and potentially the ballot box, and at the workplace, that as you and others are aware of sometimes
Yeah.
means that you have to withdraw your labor or your participation in order to be able to
Exactly.
enact the true nature of
Yeah.
what it means to have these human rights.
Exactly. So I mean, I just strongly echo this. I mean, that it is the streets, it is the ballot boxes where we are make ourselves heard, and people need to unionize in order to, effectively giving life to Article 6 of the covenant. People need to, even I mean, I don't want to instigate, some sort of a socialist insurrection here, but people who are facing to be kicked out of the houses need to really repossess the houses.
Yeah.
People need to fight back, and I think the first way is really civil resistance, civil action. And one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, I mean, before he passed away, he's always portrayed as this person who fought for civil and political rights solely, but he turned before he died, he turned into social rights activism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a great threat to the United States.
Yep. That's when their knees started buckling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's when, they started to realize, oh, this is going the wrong direction. We gave them their rights to vote. Now he wants actually the right to work. Now he wants the right to fair housing and much, much more. And that's something that we don't want to give.
Yeah.
So also Malcolm X turned into, very strong social activism, and stressing social economic rights. I think that was the point when the powerful became really worried about their status quo.
Yeah, totally.
Giving civil and political rights is one thing to allow some people to vote, because you can still manage what they vote and how they vote, because you can still in control of gerrymandering and everything. But if you allow people to unionize and give them the right to work, that's going to get nasty for us, because we are not maintaining the balance that we want. So look, I think the way to reclaim our rights is to protest, and it's again Martin Luther King who said the greatest right is the right to protest, and to protest for a right is the greatest right, as he said. So we need to protest, we need to activate, we need to gather, we need to assemble, to challenge the state, and making aware what kind of rights we deserve, because they are rights. They are not like granted to us. They are our inherent rights.
Yeah. Yep. And I won't quibble which one is mightier, but you need a pen and a sword, and use them both wisely.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Well, Thamil, I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm it's early in the year, but maybe this or
future
episodes on the topic will be as popular as the last one. So
I hope so too.
yeah.
I hope everybody liked it.
I think depending on how this stuff continues on too, it may be worthwhile to have a discussion about the role of the UN Security Council and Russia
Definitely.
East-West dynamics, and be able to kind of flesh that out a little bit, because I know at least in the United States the commentary is it's all Russia bad, America good, oh poor Ukrainians, and all this kind of stuff. And so and the both in one of the common articles in both of these human rights treaties is the right to self-determination. And it's very interesting to the degree to which you do or don't think that something like Crimea or the Donbass republics are expressions of that and ought to be protected. But we can also talk about, the rights of Palestinians and other, to self-determination, and the role of the United Nations Security Council in particular in either abrogating or enforcing that the right to self-determination. So that might be an interesting thing to talk about. And so plenty to talk about.
There are so much to talk about. I think we could continue to talk, and I think the whole podcast will be just only about talking about TWAILer.
This is TWAILer podcast,
it will be just a dialogue between Kevin and Thamil.
Yeah, there you go. I would listen, but of course I'm biased. All right, man. Well, have a good evening. Good luck with the stuff you got going on in the pretty near future, and keep me posted.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you to the listeners.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.